You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
The exact slang in Britain is a French polish. Because you can, in the old days, you used to be able to pay someone to give your furniture a French polish, which was a very good, high-quality polish of wooden furniture. So it became a euphemism very quickly, and it's just a very stupid, funny English thing. So there you go. I'm glad we're talking about wanking very quickly into this. It set the tone for what's about.
I mean, what else matters, dude? I mean, that's wanking. Like, that's why we live.
We talked about Rick Parfitt. And because it talks about the whole Quo phenomenon.
Was that the Dead Rock Stars?
Yeah, it was one of that series.
Dude, that was my favorite podcast.
But yeah, that had a good reaction, that podcast. I love doing it.
Dude, I love the way he busted your balls on that, man. That was fucking
classic.
But anyone that busts your balls like that is a friend of mine.
Go on, Eric, let's get to it, you mad dog.
So anyway, Shockwave Skull Sessions. This is going to be an interesting one because we got the masters of death metal on this podcast, so to speak. Mr. Monte Conner, the man that probably created death metal, at least here in the United States, with his label Roadrunner Records back in the day.
I don't know if that's a title I want to have or run from. No, I'm kidding. Well, I wear it proud. It's better than being the king of nu metal, which I also am.
I saw that. I saw that post. What, 16 out of the bands on that list?
Yeah, something? I mean, I have signed a lot of nu metal, or have been a part of trying to sign bands that were huge, like Limp Bizkit, Deftones, whatever. But no, I can actually proudly wear my crown of nu metal because I've got credibility in death metal and all other kinds of shit. So nu metal is actually only maybe 10 to 15% of what I've signed.
See, I remember interviewing you years ago, Monty, and asked you about this, and you said that actually Roadrunner's mission was to be ahead of the curve. That was the point, rather than...
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, it was to be ahead of the curve. And then, once, 94, 95 rolled around and nu metal reared its ugly head, of course, I was right on top of that. And, in the same way that Roadrunner was doing metalcore, with Killswitch Engage in 2001 or whatever that year was. And also, people are forgetting that some people consider Vision of Disorder to be the first metalcore band, and they were, more in 90s, they were even earlier. So yeah, that was always our job, was to be on the forefront. I mean, we missed out on deathcore. We never had any deathcore at Roadrunner, but that's one area we missed out on. Not our own fault. It's just that Case Wessels, the owner, didn't want to do it. So we tried, In fact, Mike Gitter, who I worked with, brought Suicide Silence in, and I think we were looking at Job for a Cowboy as well. So we were on top of it. We just wound up not signing any of the bands.
Do any of these genres mean anything to you, Bob? I know
not a goddamn thing. But let me finish the intro here. So those that recognize that beautiful British accent in the background, all you women out there that are creaming your pants right now.
Dude, I'm not even a woman, and I'm creaming my pants.
Men and women, might I add. Joel McIver, of course, author extraordinaire.
I've had in years, Bob. Thank you very much. Yes, what a pleasure to be on your podcast again after about 20 years since the last one or something like that.
It has been a while since we jump-started the Shockwave Skull Sessions. Actually, it was Monte Conner, who I have right here, that got me on board the initial Skull Sessions back. That was 2008, right, Monty?
That's amazing.
Wow, was it that far back? I
was.
can't remember. Hey, you know what? Joel's got to go to bed, so we better dig into this.
Oh, okay. Well, let's start. But first, what I want to know, Joel McIver, the real reason for this podcast isn't to talk about death metal, but it's to talk about the Monte Conner biography. Come on, we got a Brian Slagle biography. We got a Johnny Z biography. When is the Monte Conner biography coming out, Joel McIver?
Even the dude from Noise Records did one, right? And that was a good book as well. That was a great book. I loved it.
Yeah, well, you know what I heard about the Noise book? I was told that the guy that wrote the Noise book, David Geckel, I think his name was. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but from what I was told, he only agreed to do the book if he could basically have full control over the book. So not even Carl Walterbach, the subject of the book, basically had control over it. It had to be Dave's vision, which is pretty bold. I mean,
I heard something like that. Yeah, it was like an authorized official book rather than an autobiography, if you see what I mean. It was like an official biography.
Yeah. People have asked me over the years, first of all, I can write. I am a writer. The only difference between someone like Joel and I is that Joel can just polish it off no pun intended, given our earlier conversation.
Of French polish?
The difference is I can write really well. It just takes me way more effort. So when, if it would take Joel like 6 months to write a book, it would take me 4 years. I could do it as well as him, but it just takes much more effort. And I just don't have the time to do it. But I feel like if I was going to do a book, I feel like I should write it.
No, you definitely should. If you can write, then you should. It's
I can, but it just seems weird to me to do a book when I'm still working in the music business, because invariably when you're writing a book, you're going to piss some people off, and you're going to probably have to say some things that, might get you in trouble. It's a little easier to do when you're retired or not in the business anymore. So that's part of why I haven't written it, just because I'm still in the music business. And also, I know the way I am. I'm very OCD personality, and when I do something, I do it 1,000%. And there's no way that I would be able to focus on writing that book while still doing my regular job. They would just get in the way. So I just can't do it while I'm, for those two reasons.
Even if you ever did have the time, the only way you could do it without pissing people off is to do some kind of different angle. It would be like advice to people about signing bands, that kind of thing. Sort of an industry Bible kind of.
Yeah, but how long does that take? Like people ask me, what do you look for in signing a band? And then I can like write it out in 1 page. It's easy. I don't know if that's a whole book. What would be interesting for me, I thought, if I ever did write a book, because I worked with so many bands, like I signed 78 different bands to Roadrunner, and then another 30 or so to Nuclear Blast. I thought maybe an interesting way to do a book like that, because I'm pretty much one of the only A&R guys that ever has like that volume of bands under my belt. I guess Brian Slagle would have the same amount, but I thought maybe I could do it chapter by chapter and literally just do an introduction and then have a chapter on each band or on most of the bands and kind of organize it that way. This way, it's kind of like short story reading. You can just skip around and read about the bands you want to read about instead of it being like a full narrative,
Increasingly, a lot of books are like that. If you read Tony Iommi's autobiography a few years ago, that some of the chapters were tiny. They were like 1 page or 2 pages. You just read it. You carried on with what you were doing. And in fact, Flea's book, which I've just read, is the same. It's a little anecdote. Some of the chapters are a paragraph long, because some people don't have the sort of patience to go through a 5,000-word chapter each time, like Bob, because he'd be using his finger on the page to run it under each line with his lips moving. Sorry, Bob, there's no need for me to insult you guys.
I didn't understand what that meant, but go ahead. I know a lot of chicks are looking forward to reading about your New York gigolo days there, Monte Connor.
Oh boy, it was pretty wild and pretty decadent, but whatever, let's get that.
I've still got a mustache, or was that just a 70s thing?
Nah, hey, I'm all bark, no bite. I'm like as vanilla as it comes, so yeah, I have no stories from the 70s.
Well, you got some great old pictures you could definitely put in that book, I'll tell you that, Monte.
Just want to say, I love the picture of you at Studio 54 looking at the Combat Tour. That makes me jealous. That is
oh my God, that was amazing. I remember that. I remember walking up to the club and seeing a line and seeing a camera, and I literally, like, as you can see in the footage, I am running up to the line. Like, I peer out of the blue because I literally run up and pop up in front of the camera, and that was fun. Mike Schnapp was working at Combat at the time, and I believe he wasn't editing the movie, but he was around when it was being edited. And, of course, when he spotted me, he's like, you got to put my friend Monte. And so I think he single-handedly made sure that footage was used.
What movie was that? I saw that clip you posted.
That was The Ultimate Revenge.
Oh, because they played at Studio 54, right? Yeah. The Venom Slayer?
Yeah, with Slayer, Venom, and Exodus.
I think you were like doing some disco moves and all that shit, the way Joel was talking.
No. It was it was a metal show, and at the beginning of the movie, they were filming the crowd waiting outside, kind of like heavy metal parking lot, but a line of people, and I was captured in the line, and I'm particularly proud of that because, it kind of shows that I was once that guy. I was once like a fan like anybody else, living the life. And it's kind of cool to be reminded of where you came from and that you were actually that kid once. When you're in your 50s, you're so far removed from that, that it's nice to be reminded that you were once that 16-year-old kid going crazy in the pit.
You were once a person, a normal human being like the rest of us. Never mind. Come on, Bob, you're in charge.
Death metal we're talking about. Now, you got a new book, Joel, right, on Morbid Angel coming out.
But first, Bob, who's your favorite death metal band?
I don't know what you would consider death metal these days, so I don't know.
Right.
You know what? Now that we're on that topic, I always considered the first death metal band to me would be Venom. As far as the vocal, Venom kind of coined the phrase black metal, so they became black metal. But then again, black metal today is completely different than what Venom was. The
Oh,
Norwegian black metal, the symphonic keyboard kind of thing. So before we get started, why don't both of you kind of explain what death metal is? And like to me, I would say it goes with the vocals. I mean, when Cronus came out with Welcome to Hell and League with Satan, Live Like an Angel, when I had that first single, that to me was what I would say the first sign of death metal. No? Monte, would you agree or no?
I agree, Bob. I mean, to me, I agree, Bob, that the defining characteristic of death metal are obviously the guttural death metal vocals. That's, to me, what makes it death metal. And you are right in citing Venom as potentially the first band to do that. But, of course, they got pigeonholed as black metal because of the song and because of the lyrics. But also, Venom was, punk metal. It was a big punk element to what they did, whereas if you skip forward to like the actual creation of death metal, obviously it's Possessed, who had the song Death Metal, and it's Chuck Schuldiner in the band Death. So it starts with Death and Possessed, and they don't have a punk influence in them quite like Venom does. So, I think people would commonly cite Death, Possessed, and Death as the originators of death metal. And, Venom gets the credit for black metal. But yes, clearly you could call Venom a death metal band as well.
So you're saying it basically started in the U.S. then?
Well, you could equally say that Venom also inspired Metallica and Slayer. So
true,
they inspired the whole extreme metal wave, right?
Now, what would you call like the German bands that came out before Possessed and all that? Destruction, Sodom, Creator, even Celtic Frost, Bathory. Would that be?
Oh, wait, was it before, though? It was concurrently, because Sodom and Destruction, that was like 94, 95, just as...
No, we're talking 84.
Monty meant to say 84, 85.
Yes, sorry, meant, yeah.
But
all those bands you just mentioned, the German thrash bands, Creator, Sodom and Destruction, basically came after Death and Possessed.
You sure? I don't know.
No, they did. No, Monty's right. What you might be thinking of, Bob, is Hellhammer, which was the predecessor of Celtic Frost.
Right.
And they were around in, I think, 84, Monty, something like that.
Well, they had the demos out.
I think Hellhammer was 84.
No, they were like 82, 83 with their demos.
But Venom's first album was January 81, so as a writer, people always say, hey man, when did thrash metal start? And, extreme metal start. And I normally say, look, you might as well say the first Venom album in January 81. So Metallica and Slayer both came out in 83. Then the Germans came out afterwards, as Monty's just said. But Hellhammer were a little bit ahead.
Yeah.
But wait, was anybody doing guttural death metal vocals before Kronos? I don't think so.
What about... No, not before. I mean, you could point to Bathory being fairly close. They were like 82, 83. Venom beat Bathory easily. Yeah. But their inspiration, Bathory's inspiration was the punks band, the British punks, Discharge, and the rest of it, and Crass, and the rest of that lot, which only came out a bit later in their career. Okay, so if you want to talk about death metal, Bob, it was Jeff Becerra, wasn't it, who came out with the term. Although actually, your boy Quorthon from Bathory told me that he also wrote a song called death metal very early on in his career. And I mentioned this to Jeff from Possessed, and he was really pissed off and said, no, I was the guy who came out with the term death metal. It's weird, though. There was an LP, wasn't there? It came out on Noise called Death Metal.
It was a sampler. But even that, Joel, I think that was like 84, 85.
And it had,
when was the first? When was Seven Churches? Was that 84?
I think it was 84. Yeah.
Right. So that would be, I think, roughly around the same time as the death metal sampler. But no, trust me, I don't think Noise and the death metal sampler is where that was coined. I think it was.
That was just a name they came up with to sort of literally record. So once Possessed was up and running with that first album, and then Mantis and then Death came along, I think it was established. But I mean, I'm a little bit younger than you guys, as far as I understand. Even in 82, 83, Metallica were calling themselves power metal, and the thrash, the actual thrash metal term, never mind death metal, didn't come out until, was it Don Kay came out with that name in about 85, that kind of time?
Which name?
The actual term thrash metal, right? It was either
wasn't Don. Definitely not. The thing that Don coined, that Don is famous for, is the Big Four, yeah.
Thrash, yeah.
The same way that Jeff Barton coined new wave of British heavy metal.
Maybe
Don was the Big Four.
Domi was the guy who came out with thrash metal there. So
who was?
I think Malcolm Dome was the guy who came up with thrash metal, possibly.
Right. He didn't in the documentary that I did. He said people keep saying I did, but I didn't, according to him. So.
Oh, then, well, who knows? I mean, you had Anthrax doing that song "Metal Thrashing Mad." you had thrash. Thrash was a term associated with the skaters, wasn't it?
Well, it was always speed metal back in the day. It was that was the first term, speed metal.
Yeah, I remember Dark Angel used to call himself speed metal before.
You know what we're missing on this conversation? We're missing
metal.
For once, we could use Martin Popoff, because Popoff is obsessed with shit like this. Like, he'll write an entire book on it and trace the origins. Like, if you're talking about thrash metal, for me it started with Motorhead, but of course, Martin will find a way to take it all the way back to 1970 and analyze it.
I asked Lemmy if he minded that people thought of his band as a thrash metal band, and he said, that makes me cringe. I hate that.
Yeah. Hey, they're rock and roll. He considers them rock and roll.
Well, just like bands hated being called
metal.
You know
what, though? But bands, one thing I'm discovering is all bands hate being put in a box. I mean, it is rare to find a band like Judas Priest that embraces the tag heavy metal and being the kings of that.
They
bands
were the first band to do it.
Yeah, most bands hate being put in a box. You know what? I'd rather be the kings of stoner rock or death metal or some smaller genre than just trying to lump yourselves in with music in general. Like Lemmy does with rock and roll.
Well, I don't think they were like the categories, because back in the day, bands liked to be called progressive, not in the progressive that you think about like Yes and Genesis, but the term progressive meaning moving forward. That was like a compliment, whereas heavy metal was like noise. It meant it had negative connotation. They used to call progressive rock, you might remember this, in the old Cream magazines, it was called pomp rock. Pompous.
Well, no, progressive, it was called, I believe, progressive was a description before prog as a genre existed.
Yeah, but progressive was it, I mean, when it became prog, that was when it became like, they called it Yes and ELP and all those bands. But progressive was just basically you're a forward-thinking band. From what I remember when it first came out. But pump rock, I remember bands like Styx and all those bands were like, pump rock.
I knew it would be a matter of minutes before Bob started talking about his bands from the 60s. Listen.
The 60s, look at Joel. God, you are a kid, aren't you?
As I recall, the first time progressive metal term was used was with Queensryche, right? That was the first time I ever saw that come out in about
with which band?
Queensryche.
Right. Yeah,
maybe.
Anyway, look. So while we're on the death metal subject,
speak, Joel.
So to me, it's been amazing to watch it develop in real time from essentially a slightly more raucous, underproduced form of thrash metal to an actual tone and sound of itself. Which to me, I guess, well, what we're going to say, Monte, this is where you come in with the early signings to Roadrunner from Obituary, Deicide, maybe, and bit later on, it was Cannibal Corpse.
Well, yeah, the thing is, when I started at Roadrunner, I was the only A&R guy at the label at the time when I started in early '88. So the only reason Roadrunner became a death metal label at that point is because the whole label was beholden to what I was into. And at that particular moment, death metal was what I loved. So I started signing all those bands. But even then, I was late. Like when I started in '88, this was like many years after Death and Possessed, so it wasn't like I was being a pioneer as far as signing death metal. It already had existed. But I think what I can take credit for, besides picking some great bands, was that these bands being on a label like Roadrunner really took them into the mainstream. So for the first time, even more so than Death and Possessed, you saw bands like Sepultura and Obituary really, really taking death metal into the mainstream. Like if you look at a band like Obituary, their sound is so based on Celtic Frost. But they're so, even though Celtic Frost are complete pioneers and legends, Obituary were a more commercially successful band. So I think Roadrunner really helped popularize the genre and take it into the mainstream and show everybody that there was real commercial value in it. And then, of course, once those bands hit, and Earache was doing it right at the same time as us, like concurrently, like us. Really, Roadrunner and Earache were the leaders of that back then. And then once we started having success and Earache started having success, the genre just flooded and everybody started signing that stuff. And, by the time of like 93 hit, the owner of Roadrunner, Case Wessels, just basically didn't want to do that anymore. He ordered me to stop signing death metal. He thought it was saturated and it was time for something new, and basically wouldn't let me sign it anymore.
What about Deicide? Wasn't Deicide before Obituary or no?
No, Deicide's debut record, I believe, was in 1990. The first two death metal records that Roadrunner put out under myself was Sepultura Beneath the Remains in April '89, and then Obituary in May '89, like shortly after.
So I think the first Morbid Angel album was '88 on Earache. And I think also that Max always regards Sepultura as a sort of thrash death crossover. So when I think about the Roadrunner oeuvre, I always think...
I think Morbid Angel was '89, Joel.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
So So when I think about what Roadrunner did, I just think about Deicide and Obituary just bursting the doors open, with those first two things, post-Sepultura almost, because the sound was so different. The vocals in Obituary, to me, was the ultimate statement of death metal vocals, right, at that time. You couldn't really...
I mean, by the way, there were some lyrics on, you could hear a chorus or a line here or two on Slowly We Rock, but most of it, I would say 90% of it wasn't lyrics. And of course, we played up the angle of Obituary having like scatting vocals instead of lyrics.
Yeah.
We thought that was a unique angle, and people loved it. And I mean, God, John Tardy, there was nobody that sounded like that guy. And he still sounds like that today. I saw Obituary live a few weeks back, and, Tardy still sounds amazing. And, the band are more legendary than ever. Obviously, having been at it a while, people have been calling them legends for like the last, 15, 20 years or so. But now, I don't know what's happened with Obituary as of late, but over the last couple of years, they just truly ascended to this bigger legendary status than they had before.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing to see how big that band is right now. They're making, they're drawing more kids on the road live now than they did at their heyday. Probably making more money than they ever made back in their prime.
But a lot of bands like that. I mean, you look at the Misfits and a lot of these bands that are doing these reunion tours and stuff. They're bigger now than they were in their heyday. It's insane.
Look at King Diamond now. I mean, King Diamond's like the hottest property live,
I was talking to the guys from Carcass a couple of years ago, and when they came back, I don't know, it's probably about 5 years ago now, isn't it, that they came back, they told me they were making way more money than they ever did back in the day. Because they were just a little grindcore band at the time. And again, Britain's contribution, I think, to the death metal thing, because, this is all part of the big picture of how much we suck at heavy metal these days, other than with the classic bands like Maiden and the rest of them. We have all these small bands, but at least grindcore was our thing, I think. Although now I've said that, I'm thinking about Repulsion, who may have pioneered it a bit and terrorized it, actually. But we had Napalm Death and Carcass, didn't we? Anyway, the point is that these bands come back, Bob, as you were saying, and they make an awful lot of money. And you can't blame them, right? It's like you, Bob, when you came back and did the Skullsessions.
You made so much money. Incredible amount of money.
And then the other thing,
isn't it Carcass? What's his name from Sweden, right?
Who are you talking about?
No, I'm not thinking Carcass. Arch Enemy, the guy from Arch Enemy, the guitarist. No, what was the guy from Arch Enemy's old band? Wasn't that Carcass?
Carcass.
Yeah. He's Swedish.
Yeah, so you're thinking of the Swedish guy, Mike Amott.
Yeah, he's so.
Why do you bring him up?
Because you were saying the British band. I thought they were Swedish. It's
it's apart from one Swedish guy. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
Thanks.
Hey, I mean, the Swedes
kind of like the EF band, right,
death,
Monte?
Swedish death metal was its whole other thing than regular death metal.
Okay.
Well, not only that, you can divide it into Gothenburg and Stockholm death metal, can't you?
Yeah. So, when I think of Sweden, I think of Nihilist / Entombed. To me, Entombed or Ground Zero Swedish death metal, and it was all to do with the guitar sound and the pedals they used to just make the guitar sound like that. It was just something in the water in Sweden.
That's funny. When I think of Swedish death metal, I think of Europe, The Final Countdown.
That's a big death metal band, Bob. No, definitely. Along with Yngwie Malmsteen.
Had to throw that in there.
So to me, I have a vested interest in this because I wrote their book, but Cannibal Corpse are now the biggest selling death metal band, I believe.
Yeah, they are. Well, part of why they are the biggest is they're also the longest running. That Cannibal Corpse has been running continuously since '88, I believe, whereas bands like Morbid Angel have come and gone, members have left. Well, actually, members have come and gone from Morbid Angel too. But even a band like Obituary, spent a few years in the wilderness. Same thing. Obituary and Deicide both took time off. So Corpse are the longest running band who's consistently put records out. I think that's part of why they're the biggest selling death metal band, just by virtue of going the entire time. Not to take anything away from the talent of the band, of course.
Well, they had a lot of luck as well when your esteemed former Vice President Al Gore mentioned them in a speech, didn't he? Was it Al Gore? Yeah, it was. Wait, was it Al Gore? Who the fuck was it? The guy who called out all these evil bands on TV.
It might have been Al Gore because I associate him with the PMRC, so maybe that's.
Yeah, well, his wife ran that, didn't she?
Yeah, she read the lyrics off, and
But then the other thing was that
Jim Carrey.
Carrey film as well. Yeah. They had an enormous stroke of luck. But also they're technically brilliant. And I say this, I wrote their book, so I'm a big fan. They seem that they're actually, I was listening to their stuff today. They're kind of like, they have all these catchy melodies, these guys as something really brutal, which I think is why they're memorable. Because frankly, a lot of death metal, which is I think one of the points we should cover, is not that memorable, right? When you reach a certain level.
I second that.
Yeah, well, Bob, you would.
You know the most, Joel, I've said this before, and I've a bunch of times, but you know what the most commercial death metal record is of all time? I literally call this record the Bon Jovi of death metal. Do you know what record that is?
Do you mean the biggest selling or the most commercial sounding?
The most commercial, literally, like if Bon Jovi were to make death metal, it would be this record and this band. Can you name
Celtic
the
Frost?
record?
Who is it?
Deicide, Once Upon the Cross.
Oh, yeah. I remember you
because if you distill that record down to its elements, every song is like between 3.5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's structured. It's got verses, chorus, hooks. It's totally catchy. There's not an ounce of fat on it. It's literally like Bon Jovi for death metal. I mean, that record is so commercial. It's ridiculous.
Yep.
If you think about it in those terms.
Yeah, as in the structures are conventional, but the image and the sound is brutal, so that's what people assume it is. Yeah, cool, man. So, Bob, you never listened to this stuff, did you? You kind of tuned out pretty quickly.
You know, after Venom, but my thing was Destruction, because I used to get those records when I was doing the Headbanger.
I love all that stuff.
I still love Creator. I saw them recently. And then Sepultura, when I worked at Roadrunner, obviously, I started in 91, I think, and that was when Arise had just come out, and Obituary and all that. So I was getting, but the Gore Guts, all that stuff. I mean, to be honest, it all kind of sounded the same to me. I loved Exodus. I mean, I guess they're not death metal; they're thrash, obviously. But vocally, that's about as far as I go. When it gets too much into that guttural thing, I just tune off.
By the way, it wasn't Al Gore; it was Bob Dole who said that stuff.
Oh wow! Okay.
About these terrible bands that would reduce the youth of America to nothing.
Right,
so look, you're a big death metal fan, Monte. So you just hoovered up these amazing bands, primarily the Florida lot, right? Or did you also sign Immolation and Suffocation in the New York lot?
See, now you're mentioning there's a whole other wave of Roadrunner death metal, what we call the shun bands: Malevolent Creation, Suffocation, Immolation. I think there's a fourth one too in the shun bands. But no, I mean, I did kind of get a little caught up in it. It just seemed like it was really easy to sign death metal bands. We were having so much success with it, and I was kind of just basically signing any death metal I could get my hands on at some point. And
Pestilence as well, right?
We did have Pestilence, yeah. But some people feel like it's funny because at the time that I signed the band Gore Guts, people looked at that as like, okay, you're really scraping the barrel now. This is like third-rate death.
Yeah.
Like we had signed so many pioneering, legendary death metal bands that when I started signing bands like Gore Guts and Sorrow, I felt like I was scraping the barrel. But the ironic part is, especially with the band Gore Guts, is that would have been true of Gore Guts back then, but now Gore Guts, they eventually became this progressive death metal behemoth band. Like they're complete trailblazers now, like considered like one of the all-time unique death metal bands. So I guess my point is, even when I was fucking up, I was still winning.
Now, speaking of unique death metal bands, let me get Joel's opinion and yours, Monte. Voivod, because they were a band I always liked. And they really progressed into something different. Now, they started out as death metal, right? Would that be? What would you consider thrash metal, even with the vocals?
Crossover. But no, they were a progressive band, really. They've been in the various prog magazines quite a lot over the years.
Yeah,
at the time, I'll be interested to hear your view on this, Monty. But at the time, they were uncategorizable, really.
I mean, if you look at, they really started becoming, very progressive around the time of Killing Technology and Dimension Hatros. But if you look at Voivod at the most primitive stage, which was the War and Pain record,
that first album,
to me that was more punk, thrash punk, had nothing to do with death metal.
Well, the vocals were very death, I thought. I mean, it was the first.
Not really, not guttural like that. Nobody would consider Snake to be a death metal vocalist.
And also, Bob, I think death metal is a sound. It's got blast beats are common. A very, very deep, down-tuned, thick, fat production for the guitar, super, super guttural, not like shrieked or screamed vocals necessarily, or kind of raw vocals, but deep, deep guttural ones, kind of like George Fisher does. So to me, that's what distinguishes the thrashers from Germany, say, who did that kind of high-pitched, shrieky stuff, which was amazing. And it was fast with thrash beats, but there were no blast beats. And then the death metal stuff, which was way, way deeper and more,
I mean,
sort of cultural. Yeah.
That's a good point, because Millie from Creator doesn't really have death metal vocals, although Venter from Creator did, and Venter sang a lot on the early, on the first few records. But Sodom had the guttural vocals right from day one.
Yeah.
Destruction didn't have them either, actually.
I remember in Kerrang, briefly, when they were casting around for something to call Creator, they called them a hate metal band, which was really, really cool, because it was to do with Miller's vocals, where he kind of hissed the vocals. It sounded really angry, which but they dropped the stupid term after a while. But it was
but those bands, they're considered to be the big three of German thrash. People don't, Sodom, Creator, and Destruction are not considered to be death metal bands. I mean, Sodom would be the closest of those three. I would consider Sodom to be a death metal band, but not the other two.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you something you brought up interesting about the cultural thing, because with metal, it's definitely obvious with how everything was so different. The new wave of British heavy metal bands of the early 80s sounded so much different than the German bands, like Accept, that kind of kraut sound, or the French bands, or the, Swedish bands always had like a melodic thing. Was that similar with death metal from country to country there? You mentioned about the German bands, Creator, Sodom, Millie from Creator, and the vocals. Was that something distinct that you don't find anymore? Because now everything's so universal. It doesn't matter where you're from.
I mean, all I can do is refer to Florida death metal, New York death metal, and then the two different strands of Swedish death metal. Other than that, there wasn't really a British death metal scene of much note. Canadian death metal, you've got Cataclysm, you've got Gorguts, and you've got Cryptopsy, right? So there was a certain Canadian sound, which is amazing, but I guess Canada's better known for the cool thrash band, right? Like
the thing is, though, I know what you mean. Like, yes, there were different pockets of death metal around, but ultimately, is there a big difference between Canadian death metal or Floridian death metal or English death metal? Like, it's, to me, like, I hear a huge chasm and a dividing line between traditional death metal and Swedish, because the Swedish was defined by that guitar sound. You could hear it from a mile away within 5 seconds of it coming on. You're like, okay, they're from Sweden.
You mean the Stockholm stuff, the Entombed and Dismember and all that kind of stuff?
Yes. To me, like, you can hear it. All you got to do is hear a guitar note, like 3 seconds of guitar, and you're like, okay, that band's from Sweden. And that was defining. But you couldn't say that about other death metal. You couldn't, like, hear 5 seconds of a band from Florida and say, okay, that's Floridian death metal.
Compare the Stockholm stuff you just mentioned to the Gothenburg stuff. So At the Gates being the biggest band, right, which went on to be the Haunted, or the super, super melodic, loads and loads of influences from Iron Maiden. The point Bob made earlier about Mike Amott sort of turning Carcass into one of those bands, or the other way around, those bands taking their cue from Carcass. You had this one small country with two very, very different but equally important death metal scenes, which always blew my mind. You could argue that New York death metal and Florida death metal were different, but that's more acceptable because America's so massive with such a huge population.
Hey, take a New York band like Incantation. Like, what's the difference between Incantation or Immolation and some band from Florida? You know what I mean? Like, it's all so close in the end,
See, I can hear it. And I listen to Suffocation, which is a New York band, if I'm right. And then I compare them to Deicide or Obituary. I can hear it clear as day. There's something. This may be just my British perspective, but there seems to be something quite New Yorky about that lot.
Well, I agree. I definitely agree on Suffocation. It's funny because Suffocation is another band. Like, we couldn't give those records away back in the old days, and now they're being hailed as like the fathers of deathcore.
Let me ask you something, Monte, regarding like a band like Suffocation, because I noticed it's with a lot of death metal bands, whereas usually regular metal bands that would sign with Roadrunner, you would have more of a long-term contract. But I remember Suffocation, they were on Metal Blade, they were on, Roadrunner, they were on, I think, Combat or one of those other labels. They were on like 3 or 4 different labels.
Well, that goes back to what I was saying, Bob. Like, some bands, Roadrunner, we would sign long-term deals with all these bands. We're talking 7, 8 record deals religiously for all these like classic Roadrunner bands that you would mention. They all had like 6, 7, 8 album deals. But if you notice, there are only 3 Suffocation records. There's 1 Immolation. There are 3 Malevolent Creation. I told you, by the time 93 came along, Case Wessels just wanted out of death metal. We dropped these bands.
Wow.
I mean, they weren't selling a ton. We didn't drop Obituary or Deicide, but bands like Suffocation, Malevolent Creation, Immolation, Gorguts, we dropped them all. because Case was over it. He didn't want Roadrunner to be a death metal label, and these bands weren't selling. He would have dropped Obituary if he could have, but they were selling too many records to do that. So the smaller bands all got dropped. I was frustrated. I don't want to drop these bands. And, and the band, now you look at bands like Immolation, they're on their 12th record or whatever, and they're still going, and they're like these legendary bands, and we dropped them.
This brings me to Morbid Angel, about whom I have an announcement to make, Bob, as you kindly mentioned earlier. Yes. They benefited from what was perceived in about 93 as death metal being the next big thing, and they signed to Giant, didn't they, which was a Warner subsidiary.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
And in fact, wait, you were asking me this before, Joel? We were talking about like what the biggest selling death metal band is, and it is Cannibal Corpse, but the death metal band that has the biggest selling record is Morbid Angel. I believe it was one of those two records on Giant when they moved to the major label, sold like 150,000 copies or something. It is the highest selling death metal record in America to this day.
It's because, and I know this, had the pull to get those videos played on MTV. And when the Rapture and God of Emptiness got played on Beavis and Butthead, who relentlessly mocked those videos, played them again and again and again, and every time they played,
it's the key.
Beavis and Butthead helped break the band Grunt Rock on Roadrunner, right? They were like a grunge band. Roadrunner were not known for anything other than metal back then. Grunt Rock didn't fit the label at all. 55,000 copies of the second Grunt Rock record. We sold maybe like 65,000 of the second record, because Beavis and Butthead made fun of one of their videos. How great is that?
It's absolutely great.
That was huge at the time, Beavis.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone wanted to be on.
A big announcement I'm working towards is that about 4 years ago, David Vincent, who was at the time the singer of Morbid Angel, and is no longer the singer of Morbid Angel, he and I decided to do his autobiography, and it's done. And it's coming out on Jawbone Press in England in February 2020. And it's titled I Am Morbid, 10 Lessons Learned from Extreme Metal, Outlaw Country, and the Power of Self-Determination. And
wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Congratulations. It's funny, David and I, we were kind of, people don't know this, but back when Earache, we tried to license, or I at Roadrunner wanted to bring over a bunch of the Earache catalog to America. So I was trying to get Morbid Angel and Carcass and all the big Earache bands. I wanted to license them for America to put out on Roadrunner, and we just couldn't reach a deal with Digby. And then I don't know if it was I don't know what the problem is. Maybe we had some of the bigger bands and whatever. But yeah, David and Vincent and I just had kind of a weird relationship back then. But but over the years, of course, you grow up and mature. Now it's like I communicate with Dave, and it's like it's like an old lost friend. Like we get along so well, so differently than we did back in the heyday.
Well, one of the great things he talks about, Monte, in the book, and he says this very, very explicitly and self-admittedly, is that he had to go through an awful lot of personal development after a few years in Morbid Angel. He had become a diva. And he was acting in a sort of a negative way to a lot of people.
Yeah, I was one of those people.
You experienced some of that, right? And he quit the band to get himself out of that frame of mind, and subsequently did do that, and developed a lot of empathy and developed a lot of understanding in a way that he didn't have, and came back a much, much better person, and that's the person that you know today.
No, I noticed that about him. And you know what? I never hold any grudges. Like, we were all kids back then, and everybody progresses at their own rate. And to me, it's so silly. Like, you look back at the things of the past, it all seems so silly now. Like, back then, when we were in the thick of it, the success of these records and how the mixes were and how they sounded and how they sold, it was life or death. The same way you see like a 6-year-old kid throwing a temper tantrum because he can't get his favorite video. Like, this kid is throwing a temper tantrum, and you're looking at him as an adult just thinking like, why is this little kid freaking out over something so meaningless? But, when you're living it and you're that age, everything feels life or death. And, of course, with the experience of having it 30 years in the past and being an adult, you could look back at that stuff that you used to fret over and fight about, and it's such a joke. It doesn't mean anything,
Most of us don't have to go through it in the public eye as well, thank God. If I'd been 16 years old and there'd been Facebook and Twitter, I'm sure I would have placed some things on there that I would subsequently regret.
Yeah. Thank God social media didn't exist back then.
Right, and and digital cameras as well. You know what I mean? And so David went through all this stuff. So one of the reasons why it's not a standard heavy metal autobiography is that there's this giant sort of change in the middle. He kind of went from being this. The word he uses is a dick, to being a much more sort of empathetic person and being much more like Bob Nalbandian, actually, like a really nice guy that everyone loves. But the point is that the message in the music is the same as it was in Morbid Angel songs, which sort of preaches autonomy and independence and standing up for yourself and all those good things. So anyway, we spent a few years on that. I was over in Texas at his house doing the interviews for that a few years ago, and I'd never been to Texas. I really enjoyed it. Thought it was a fantastic place. On one of the days, we went out and did a road trip and saw a lot of the sort of the desert. Really, it felt like to me.
Right. You guys, that sounds great. That's going to be a great book.
Joel, let me ask you something, because a lot of people refer to death metal as being the lyrics, particularly Cannibal Corpse. Their lyrics are all about death. Now, you mentioned about Morbid Angel, how their lyrics are have nothing to do with death, because that always seemed to be the common ground with death metal bands. It was all about death, destruction, killing, and necrophiliism and all that kind of shit.
It wasn't all about...
Was that just old school death metal, or was that...
a small number of songs that were lyrically quite offensive, right? And then you had sort of generic slasher movie bands like Death, for example. Their first record, Scream Bloody Gore, is about that stuff. Cannibal's first couple of records were very explicitly about murder and rape and torture and death. But then you had Deicide, who didn't sing about that stuff. They sang about the devil, right?
And then you had Carcass sing, and then you had Carcass using like medical terms.
They had a pathology manual which they used for their early songs. But then most of these bands grew away from that stuff. I think Deicide is still doing the old satanic thing because they kind of have to. Cannibal is still doing the kind of graphic zombie murder, cut you into pieces bit again because they kind of have to. But I think, Bob, the answer to your question is that stuff was what they did when they were young and 25 years old or 21 years old, that kind of thing. And they were trying to shock, just like Slayer did, and actually Metallica did on that first record. And, all of us do when we're young and trying to be sort of shocking and rebellious. The majority moved away into something a little more intelligent. Carcass, for example, Napalm Death, look at them. That is one seriously politicized and aware.
Oh, absolutely.
And same in Morbid Angel, actually. Morbid's first record was basically about the devil. And then after that, they got much more into David's point of view about being sort of autonomous, leading your life in an independent way, which was good, intelligent stuff. So the short answer, Bob, is that you can get intelligent lyrics in this form of music. It's just not known for that, because that wasn't its function in its early days, if you see what I mean.
You just can't get intelligent vocals, but lyrics,
David Vincent,
okay.
George Fisher from Cannibal, they pride themselves on doing the guttural thing where the words are clear.
Yeah, actually, no, that's enunciated death metal vocalist. You could understand his words. Another one was Glenn Benton from Deicide.
Yeah.
That's what people love so much about those early Deicide records. Glenn, you can really, really hear Glenn. He's very, very clear. He's on top of the music. You can make out the words, and he's dominating the same way David Vincent was. I would say David Vincent and Glenn Benton are like definitely two of the greatest death metal singers ever. Easily.
Yeah, you can hear the stuff, but it still has the brutal feel that people actually want from the music. There you go, Bob. Any other questions for us death metal king?
What would you guys say? Because to me, especially the newer death metal, production-wise, all kind of sounds the same, just levels all the way up. What do you think is the best produced death metal album?
God,
Monte?
That's a hard question to answer. One of the records, I can't even name it, but I know that the first Cannibal Corpse record done with Colin Richardson set like a standard at the time, because all of Cannibal Corpse's early records were with Scott Burns, who had a certain sound, but it got really, really hi-fi when they went to Colin. I definitely would cite the Carcass record. What's the record? The big one with Buried Dreams. That sounds amazing.
Is it Heartwork?
Heartwork. The Entombed record, Wolverine Blues. I like the production. Obviously, we won't talk about Sepultura because they weren't really a death metal band other than on the early records. Fear Factory's Soul of a New Machine had great production.
Now, were they considered death metal, Fear Factory?
And then they kind of tightened it up, didn't they, and had those more choppy riffs and eventually a little more new metal in their sound.
Well, the thing that the defining aspect made them unique was they would literally the ground zero band in metal that had good cop, bad cop vocals. So even though there were death metal vocals on Soul of a New Machine, there was also singing. They would go to singing on the choruses, and I know that sounds cliched now, but they were literally the first band to do that. I mean, now it's like songwriting heavy metal 101 to kind of have cleans and heavies in the same song, but they pioneered that. They didn't invent it, like Burton C. Bell will basically credit to that for Head of David, which is a band he was into. But
Yeah.
Fear Factory certainly pioneered it within the metal world, and especially, in a death metal world. So
The Cannibal album you're thinking of that was produced by Colin Richardson, I think, is Bloodthirst. I think that was their first
Right.
one. And
Yeah.
actually, that came out in 99. So you had a lot of kind of average to insufficient production before then in death metal. And I think it only really became understood about the wide range of frequencies that you needed. And there's something to do with the down-tuning of the guitars as well. And
but then again, Colin Richardson was, kind of brought high fidelity to death metal, and that was way before 99. I mean, he did Soul of a New Machine for me in 92. He was doing Carcass before then, so it really goes earlier. I just don't think Corpse ever hooked up with someone on that level until then.
What about Jim Morris? He seems to be, as far as the Florida death metal,
No, it's
he
more
seems
Scott
to
Burns.
be like
Scott
the
Burns
guy.
Occasionally, Jim Morris and
Burns.
Tom Morris would overlap and help Scott out or take over certain projects, but really, Scott Burns is the father of Florida death metal, for sure.
Yeah, I guess Jim Morris did do a lot of like
Worked with
Iced
Death.
Earth
I
and with the
believe
power
Jim Morris
too.
produced and mixed a Symbolic record by Death, which sounds amazing. So yeah, Jim and Tom Morris both did great work.
the stuff is hard to play and it's hard to record. And so you need extremely good musicians, good songwriting, a good studio, and a good engineer and a good producer. And if you have all those things, it's going to sound good. But I don't think all those things came together until until a few years after death metal had been around. Which is why, Bob, I think the early stuff has this reputation of being sort of a mess, and a bit raw and a bit punky and a bit crap.
I kind of prefer that.
I'm not
Voivod, the
I
old
think it has a lot of
Destruction,
charm. And sometimes you don't want perfectly crafted, precision engineered music, do you? You want something that sounds a bit raw and a bit nuts.
But also, some of the Death records sounded good, like Scream Bloody Gore was produced by Randy Burns. That record, for its time, sounded world class.
Yeah.
Leprosy sounded great. Spiritual Cleaning, Spiritual Healing has good production. In fact, their production went backwards. Like on the Human record, it just started sounding lo-fi and muddy.
Yeah, man. It'd be interesting to see what Chuck would have gone on to do had he lived longer than he did.
Yeah. I've known Chuck all along. I mean, I was a fan. I was a tape trader trading tapes with Chuck. I just was not in a position to sign the band. I wasn't working in the music business at the time that Death came along, but our paths did cross for the Symbolic record in 95, which I'm really proud of. I think that's one of the band's greatest records ever. It was a short-lived union. It was a short honeymoon period before Chuck turned on me, like he did on most people, and hated me.
That's what I've heard. Bob, I think an interesting point is to ask, and you mentioned it earlier, does the stuff sound the same nowadays? And there's something when you get to our point in life, if you don't put in the effort, music does sound the same, doesn't it? Unless you make an absolute effort to hear it. But something does tell me that in the era of producing everything on a laptop with the same plugins, things do sound kind of samey. And the sort of shrieked deathcore vocals don't do it for me in the way that the deep ones do, the Glenn Benson and George Fisher's.
Well, that's with all different types of music, not just death metal. I think the digital era has made it so easy for people to record at home that everything's kind of sounding generic.
I do think that a little bit. Yeah, I hate to say it because it's such a cliche that you hit, you come to 50 or whatever, and suddenly it all sounds the same because you don't make the effort. But it kind of does feel like that, and you hear it from a lot, actually, don't you?
Well, not only is it produced the same, using the same plugins and samples, but then even if a band does make an effort to sound a little bit different, then when it gets brick-walled and in the mastering stage where you have this high-fidelity mix that's put through a straw before it reaches your ears, so even if it does have a little bit of a unique sound in the production and mix, you lose some of that when it gets mastered. So by the time you're hearing it brick-walled and heard through a straw, it all sounds the same.
I was just interviewing last week Michael Beinhorn. You guys know who that is?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was telling me that...
great producer.
The greats. He did Marilyn Manson, Ozzy Osbourne, all this stuff. Hole, Soundgarden. And he was saying that it's not so much that people don't care about sound quality anymore, although we think that they do. It's actually the people who sell the music who don't care about the quality anymore. They just want it to sound acceptable for radio.
Well, it's not even radio. Everyone listens in their headbuds, their earbuds now. And they all listen through computer speakers. Back in the day, I don't know if Joel remembers these days. He's a bit younger, but you remember the days of the big giant speakers, Monte.
Yeah,
and,
I think it's that the consumers don't care. Like Bob said, you're listening to them on earbuds, through your computer speakers, you're on Spotify. People just don't care. Yes, there are people that worship high fidelity and still have big stereos and care, but that's a small minority. Most are happy to listen on.
One thing that you both pancake speakers in their cars. right? That's actually quite a common thing. So a certain degree of lows and fidelity is required, you know. So I'm not sure. I know about the fucking 1-inch phone speaker that people listen to, and the TV speaker and the little tiny earbuds, which I hate. I know, I can't stand all that stuff. But I still think people like music to sound good. I do.
I think people our age in their 30s and up, but I mean more and more the kids today, that's the norm.
Which is not good for death metal, actually, which is so reliant on those.
Or you know what else they have is not even boom boxes. I don't even know what they're called because I won't buy one. But you know the little Bluetooth where it's like
speaker.
Yeah, like literally, it's a Bluetooth speaker sitting on some kid's desk. It's a mono speaker. It's not even stereo. It's one fucking speaker.
Right.
I know.
My kid listens on that. My kid's a music fanatic, and he grew up.
Don't forget
I've got one of those.
The Amazon Echo thing that everyone has in their house as well, which is
it's awful.
at least does have a little bit of bass, but again, it's a mono speaker. So what are you going to do?
I just think it's nobody's fault, but it's just the way the world has been trained to listen to these days. I think the Sonics, I think it's a lost art. I think there are people that care, but I think 95% of people don't give a shit.
I Am Morbid, because not because, but that happens to be the name of the band which he's running at the moment, which plays the songs he wrote in Morbid Angel. He's doing very well. It's just announced a load of big slots at festivals next year. Morbid Angel themselves, they have continued with a different lineup. They don't really seem to be doing an awful lot. I wish them all the best, because that's a great band. But David Vincent's no longer with them. And he has this book out which talks about it's structured sort of 10 chapters. We've done, as I said, it's subtitled 10 Lessons Learned from Extreme Metal, Outlaw Country, and the Power of Self-Determination. And the idea is that it's a bit of a self-help manual is going too far, but it definitely has a lot of wisdom, about how to live life in a meaningful way. And the things we can learn through going out on stage in front of 30,000 people at Wacken and playing these incredibly complex, heavy songs. And an interesting facet to that is that rather than get some generic headbanger to do the foreword, we've got a guy called Dr. Matt Taylor, who works for the European Space Agency and was responsible for landing a camera on the Comet a couple of years ago. You may have read about this, and he's a friend of David's. So we have a scientist who's done the foreword, which is a nice change. So anyway, that's out in February on Jawbone Press, and you can get it anywhere that sells books. And you can get a hold of me, Joel McIver, all over the usual social media, and indeed David Vincent. So there will be lots and lots of press. This is a nice exclusive for you, Bob, depending on when you broadcast this podcast.
We'll get it out this week. Now, is David still performing? Is he doing like Outlaw Country? Or
Oh, God, he's performing in lots and lots of ways. He's got a band called Am Morbid, which plays Morbid Angel tunes.
Oh, okay, that's right, yeah.
Like a load of festivals next year. He has an amazing band called Ultimas, which you have to check out, which is sort of really... complex but catchy death metal, and it's formed.
Wait, isn't it it's spelled with a V? No.
Yeah, it is, but it's pronounced Ultimas. So,
okay, I heard that. I loved it. I thought it was great.
It's killer. It's with Rooney from Mayhem and Flo, the drummer from Cryptopsy. So it's a hell of a record. And then he occasionally performs in Headcat, which is a sort of rockabilly project which Lemmy used to sing.
Yeah, with a Slim Jim, right?
Cats. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
That happens every now and then.
Yeah, they used to play the Rainbow all the time. Or the
that's it. Hell of a cool record, but bad. And he does the occasional country show, and he also does things like acting and cool stuff like that. So he's an interesting guy with a lot of interesting things to say. A bit like you, Bob.
Yeah.
Not as interesting as you, Bob.
Yeah, but not nearly as interesting as Monte Connor. Monte, what do you have to say in closing this death metal podcast?
I had a lot of fun. I mean, I grew up with death metal. I signed death metal at the start of my career. I still listen to it. I still love it. And it's making a bit of a resurgence these days, too. There's definitely some cool things happening. People believe that death metal is coming back. And that bands like...
Did it go away for a while?
Well, I don't know. People seem to feel that it's kind of regaining popularity, and there are a lot of like really cool new young bands that are starting to make some waves.
You're in the position to find them running Nuclear Blast.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, that's what's great about Nuclear Blast is very much like the early days of Roadrunner. Yeah. In the old days of Roadrunner, I could pretty much do whatever I wanted and sign what I wanted. And then, of course, everything changed once Nickelback and bands like that came along and the label started experiencing mass success. And all of a sudden, selling, 30,000 death metal records didn't seem exciting anymore. So it's kind of different. I'm back to my roots here at Nuclear Blast, signing cool, heavy shit again, and it really feels like kind of like Roadrunner did many years ago. And
what's interesting is that the wheel has come full circle for Possessed, who you guys signed and put out pretty much the metal record of the year.
Yeah. Oh God, that record was amazing.
That one come in? I mean, I had no expectations at all.
Well, I had heard demos. I had heard some of the demos early on and was just right away knew they were going to make an amazing record. And, look at a band like Exhorder as well. I mean, I don't know if you heard that record, but that thing's tremendous. So it seems like a lot of these veteran bands are able to disappear for quite a few years and come back and still do it to a really, really high level. And, these bands are coming back and they're sounding like their old selves, but at the same time, there's an evolution going on, and the modern production techniques are so superior. Yeah. You listen to the way the Possessed record sounds, and you compare it to Seven Churches, and Seven Churches sounds like a 4-track demo, even though Seven Churches sounded amazing for its time. And, so it's interesting to hear these veteran bands coming back, proving that they can still do it, and coming back with modern production values as well, and sounding amazing.
Were they on Combat originally, Possessed? Weren't they Combat?
Yes.
Yeah.
The metaphor is that, you can get a young, hot stud, goes away for a few years, and then comes back looking hotter than he ever did, and his name is Bob Nalbandian.
Let me ask you one thing, Monte, being at Nuclear Blast. Are there still traditional sounding death metal bands, new bands that are coming out? Because now there's so many genres with the grindcore, the deathcore, the whatever core. Whatever. I mean, is there still would consider traditional death metal sounding bands that you're hearing coming out?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, there's this wave of bands coming now that people feel that it's not called the new wave of death metal.
Well, I know there's a lot of thrash metal bands going back to that 80s thrash sound, obviously, that you heard over the last 10 years, which I think is cool. So the same thing is kind of going on with some of that? Yeah.
I mean, look, everything goes in cycles, right? Yeah. I mean, there was a few years back, there was the return of new metal. Even dating 10 years back, you saw a whole thrash resurgence. They called it, that movement had a name. It was called neo-thrash. Some people called it re-thrash. Bands like Municipal Waste and Evil and Toxic Holocaust. There's literally dozens of these bands. None of them had the commercial heyday that the true thrash bands had. It was always, kind of a niche thing. But everything eventually comes in cycles and comes back around because, after a while, metal has always been able to innovate and keep going in new places, but, it's a little hard to do that when metal's been around now for a good 30, 40 years. It's hard to kind of reinvent. So inevitably, you come back with, fresh takes on older styles, just a modernized form of it.
There we go. It will never die.
Yes. Well, never. Good last words there, Joel McIver. It will never die. That will be on your tombstone. Joel McIver will never die. His words will last forever.
There you go. I'll come back in one form or another to haunt you.
All right, gentlemen. I know you guys are ready for a nice French polish, so I'll let you guys. Inside joke.
Podcast with we got to do a Francis Rusty podcast. Oh my God, that would be amazing.
I would
Can you make that happen?
Yeah. Make it happen, Bob.
Oh, me? Well, you know what?
You're the one that knows him, Joel.
Yeah,
well,
Joel.
I've interviewed them a few times. I sense that actually you're the true fan here, Monte. I do enjoy their stuff, but as a slightly younger gentleman than you guys, the 80s stuff is my thing. So that would be my role in this podcast, I think.
The 80s quote?
Yeah, I liked it. It was huge here. No, but you've got to understand, because from the perspective of a British teenager, they were everywhere. And the stuff was very, very well produced.
Saying you like 80s Quo is like saying you like Tony Martin era Black Sabbath over Ozzy era.
No, I fully admit that. And it took me a few years of maturity to appreciate their 70s stuff.
Wow.
But yeah, well, you're in the era you're born in, you kind of appreciate it.
Yeah, totally.
That. And then you go back, don't you, and realize how much better it used to be.
That's what I do.
I'm up for talking about some French polishing with you, Bob.
Well, it doesn't have to be with me, Joel. I mean, we can keep that out.
Near you.
All right, gentlemen. Always a fun time having you both on. We'll definitely have to get you guys back on again. And maybe with Quo. We'll see what we could do.
Oh, my God.
I know we'll have to get Jonas Auckland on that, because he's a huge
God, Jonas.
I think I might have sent you guys the link. I interviewed Jonas just a few months ago.
I saw that. That was fantastic. Yeah, for the
Yeah,
movie.
good. He's a great interviewer. I thought that film he did about Mayhem was great.
I love
What's
it.
the connection with him and Quo?
He just loves Quo. He grew up on the new wave. He left Sweden in the early 80s and went out to the Marquis, saw all those bands, Samson, Maiden, Angel Witch. And he a huge fan of that. But Quo is like one of his favorite bands of all time.
That's great. You've got to get him on. Bloody hell. He's in Bathory. The stories that guy has.
Oh, absolutely.
I need my beauty sleep.
All right, you get some
take
sleep.
care, guys.
All right, guys.
Bye-bye.
Fun time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.